What really happened to people who went missing in ancient Rome? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a world of marble streets, sandal straps, and very questionable plumbing. A world where everyone claimed to be civilized, and yet most problems were still solved with a knife. So, make yourself comfortable, dim the lights, and let's wander quietly through the shadows of ancient Rome, a city that was glorious by day and deeply suspicious by night. Because in this empire, people went missing all the time.
Come,
And more
get
often
your
than not,
finest silks.
nobody really asked
love of the
where they
gods.
went.
My
Let's start
husband
with
is
the
missing,
obvious.
I beg of you.
Rome was enormous. At its height, over
Please,
a
my
million
husband,
people
he's been
packed
gone all
into the
night.
city. That's
Go
a
home,
million
woman, we are
souls
busy.
squeezed
But he never
between
stays out
crumbling
this late.
tenements, noisy
My
taverns,
husband.
and streets
husband.
that doubled as open-air
He's been gone
sewers.
for days now.
The smell
will
alone
search
could
for
have
him.
knocked out a horse. In that chaos, people vanished constantly. Slaves ran away. Merchants disappeared on the road. Soldiers deserted. Nobles were quietly retired. And sometimes, whole families just stopped being seen. Of course, Rome didn't have a police force, not in the way we think of it. There were some watchmen, the vigiles, but they were more like glorified firefighters. If you told them your husband went missing, they'd probably hand you a bucket and tell you to look for him near the tavern.
Face the spear.
And so, the
No,
great
we
machine
will
of
not
Roman
be
life
slaves.
went on. Loud, dirty, and indifferent. If you were a slave in Rome and disappeared, no one asked questions unless you belonged to someone important. The rich treated slaves like investment property. Losing one was basically losing money. A runaway slave would have their face stamped or tattooed with
It is mine.
fugitivus,
No,
the
it is
Latin
mine.
for runaway. Imagine walking around with that on your forehead for the rest of your
That's
life.
mine, you fool.
Very subtle.
I saw it.
Some slaves
It belongs
managed
to
to
us
hide
all,
in
and-
the city's slums, blending in
This
among the
is
poor.
all I
Others
have
fled
left.
into the countryside,
mine. I
joining
saved it.
bands of outlaws or runaway
Perhaps
communities.
retirement is indeed
A few
the
even
path
made it
I
into
must now
gladiator
consider.
schools, which is an interesting
The
definition
Senate
of
suggests
freedom.
your retirement, Senator.
But most runaways were hunted down. Roman slave catchers were
the
efficient
Senate
and cruel.
has decided.
They were paid per capture.
Indeed, Senator.
So motivation was never a problem. If they caught a runaway, the punishment was spectacularly unpleasant. Crucifixion was popular, because of course it was. Romans did love their outdoor art installations. For free citizens, disappearing could mean a few different things. If you were poor, the city didn't really notice. People died of disease, hunger, and
lies
bad
ahead?
wine every
I
day.
wonder.
Bodies
Only the
were often
fated
dumped
know for
outside
certain.
the city walls, in pits known as
Those clouds
puticuli,
look menacing.
literally rotting places.
We're sailing into
A
a
fitting
storm.
name. Really, the lower classes lived stacked in wooden apartment buildings called insulae. Fire traps, most of them. One spark, and the whole block would vanish overnight. If you didn't make it out, you were just gone. By morning, your neighbors were already arguing over who got your mattress. Then there were the criminals, the ones who vanished by order of the state. Rome had a very creative justice system, by which I mean unnecessarily theatrical. Executions were public, but most prisoners didn't even make it that far. If you were accused of treason, for instance, you might be quietly escorted to a private villa and encouraged to fall on your own sword. It was considered polite. Almost a compliment. The Romans called it voluntary departure. Everyone else called it suicide under duress. Senators and generals often met this fate. One day, they'd be the pride of Rome. Statues, speeches, garlands. The next, their name was scraped off monuments, their house confiscated, and their relatives sent into exile. The Romans even had a special term for this, damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. It meant your very existence was to be erased. Imagine being so thoroughly deleted that your grandchildren had to pretend they'd never heard of you. Of course, some disappearances were quieter. Rome had its share of unsolved mysteries. There were whispers about noble women who went missing from their villas, soldiers who vanished from the frontier, and whole ships that set sail and never returned. The empire stretched too far and too thin for anyone to keep track of everything. Merchants could vanish on the road from Gaul. Messengers could disappear in the Alps. And if they did, well, Rome just found someone else to take their place. It was an empire built on replacement parts. One particularly strange case comes from the reign of Emperor Tiberius, a man so paranoid he made modern conspiracy theorists look relaxed. During his rule, dozens of people simply vanished, especially anyone accused of gossiping about him. Many of them were last seen being invited to Capri, where Tiberius kept his seaside palace, and a personal torture hobby. When they didn't come back, everyone just nodded politely and changed the subject. Because in Rome, knowing too much was a health hazard. And then there were the children, especially those from powerful families. In the Roman world, children weren't protected in the way we'd like to imagine. Infants could be legally abandoned, especially girls. Families would simply leave unwanted babies at crossroads or rubbish heaps, where they might be collected by slavers. Some of these children ended up raised in brothels. Others were sold as household slaves. And a few, very few, were adopted by wealthy patrons who wanted to look generous in front of their dinner guests. So, yes, even in the empire's golden age, Rome had a steady supply of missing persons, many of them only days old. But let's drift from the city to the frontiers, to the outposts and deserts, the windswept camps where Roman soldiers disappeared without a trace. The Roman army was enormous, hundreds of thousands of men spread across continents. If one legionary went missing, who would notice? Sometimes soldiers deserted, trying to escape endless campaigns and brutal discipline. The punishment for desertion was death, of course, but if you vanished in the forests of Germania or the sands of Syria, the empire would probably never find you. There are records of deserters joining local tribes, marrying, even becoming warlords in remote corners of the empire. But most likely, they didn't last long. A Roman without his army was like a fish without water, and often ended up just as suffocated. Now, the Roman elite had their own ways of vanishing. For them, disappearance was a political art form. If you were a senator and fell out of favor, you could expect a polite knock at your door and a suggestion to retire to the countryside. That was code for leave Rome, keep quiet, and hope the emperor forgets you exist. Many did exactly that. Some even managed to live peaceful, anonymous lives in exile. Others, less lucky, were found floating in their bath with a suspiciously tidy knife wound. Rome didn't do subtlety particularly well. And then there were those who disappeared on purpose. Spiritual runaways, if you like. By the late empire, a strange thing was happening. People began vanishing not because of politics or crime, but because they wanted out
Fresh
of
bread,
society
still
altogether.
warm from the oven.
They wandered into the
Come,
desert
get
to
your
live as
finest
hermits,
silks.
Alms,
or
for
joined
the love
early
of the
Christian
gods.
communities hiding from persecution. To their neighbors, these people were just gone, swallowed by the wilderness. But in their own minds, they were escaping something far worse. The
My
endless
husband.
noise
My husband.
of Roman life.
He's been gone for days now.
Frankly,
We will
you
search
can't
for
really
him.
blame them. We even have stories of ghosts of the disappeared, because, of course, Rome had ghosts. The Romans were extremely superstitious. If someone went missing, people would often assume their spirit was restless. They'd leave offerings at crossroads, whisper their names into the dark, or hire a priest to perform a Lemuria ritual to banish angry souls. You know, normal things, like throwing black beans over your shoulder while chanting. Because nothing says I'm fine like hurling legumes at invisible ghosts. So what did it mean, really, to go missing in ancient Rome? Sometimes it meant you'd run away. Sometimes it meant you'd been silenced. Sometimes it just meant you'd been forgotten, lost in the noise of a city that never slept, never cared, and never stopped growing. In a world that worshipped order and law, the reality was constant disappearance. Bodies
My husband
vanished.
is missing, I
Names
beg of you.
vanished. Even memories were wiped clean. Rome was eternal, yes, but its people were temporary. And yet, somehow, the empire endured. Because for every man or woman who went missing, 10 more took their place. It was a city built on anonymity, a civilization that thrived by losing
Please, my
track of
husband,
its
he's
own
been gone all
citizens.
night.
If
Go
you
home,
walk the
woman, we are
ruins
busy.
today,
But he never
past
stays
the
out this
crumbling
late.
baths, the broken columns, the shattered amphitheaters, you're walking over thousands of untold stories. Each stone might once have known a name, a face, a life that simply disappeared. And somewhere, beneath all that marble and dust, the city still murmurs. Not loudly, just faintly enough to remind us that everything we build, every name we remember, eventually fades into silence. A toothless beginning. Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back to a time before floss, fluoride, or the faintest understanding of bacteria. So, go ahead and settle in. Dim the lights, loosen your jaw, and maybe take a grateful sip of whatever minty beverage keeps your modern teeth intact. Because tonight, we're talking about a rather underrated corner of medieval life. What happened when people lost their teeth? Now, you might assume the answer is simple. They just didn't have any. And yes, in many cases that's exactly right. But as with most things medieval, the story is never quite that straightforward. There are saints involved. There are questionable cures. There are heated arguments over who should pull a tooth and what instrument of mild torture should be used to do it. And through it all, there's one constant: the quiet, resigned suffering of people who were in every sense just trying to chew their dinner. So let's drift back to a Europe that smells faintly of wood smoke, onions, and fear of infection. A world where dental hygiene was mostly theoretical, and everyone's breath could double as a weapon. The medieval mouth. A grim landscape to start. Let's establish the scene inside a typical medieval mouth. Imagine a crowded city where no one knows what a toothbrush is. Add a diet heavy in bread, ale and whatever passed for stew that day, and you've got plaque, decay, and the occasional small-scale disaster. Medieval teeth tell us an awful lot. Archaeologists have spent more time than you'd think peering into the jaws of long-dead peasants, and what they've found is a grim, crumbly mosaic of cavities, abscesses, and enamel worn down from a lifetime of chewing gritty flour. The flour, by the way, wasn't intentionally gritty. It was just that millstones shed tiny flakes of stone into the grain. Every bite of bread was basically a microdose of sandpaper. So even before the age of sugar, people's teeth were being gently eroded by their daily loaf. By middle age, a surprising number of people, peasants and nobles alike, were missing several teeth. And without dentists or dentures, your options were limited to 1. Live with it. 2. Hope it falls out cleanly. Or find someone with a pair of iron pliers and a strong stomach. Guess which option was most popular? The tooth drawer. Barber, surgeon, or local sadist now, if you lost a tooth the natural way, on, say, it just gave up and left your skull, congratulations. That was probably the least painful scenario available. But if your tooth was infected, broken, or merely inconveniently loose, you might visit the town's tooth drawer. This was rarely a professional. Sometimes it was the barber, who, in addition to trimming your hair, might bleed you, amputate a finger, or whip out a molar, all in the same afternoon. The barber surgeon's toolkit was impressive, if alarming. Scalpels, pincers, hooks, and a large smile that did not inspire confidence. For a few coins, he'd sit you on a stool, wrap a cloth around your head, and, without the benefit of anesthesia, go digging. There were also traveling tooth drawers, flamboyant showmen who set up in marketplaces with painted signs and brass instruments. They'd shout about their skills while the local crowd gathered, half horrified, half entertained. One quick yank later, and the lucky patient was left reeling, possibly missing a tooth, definitely missing some dignity. The real art wasn't in the extraction itself. That was brutal and simple. But in the theater, the tooth drawer had to distract his audience and his victim long enough to finish the job before anyone changed their mind. It's worth remembering that the average medieval person had an impressive pain tolerance. This was an age when childbirth was unmedicated, surgery involved wine and prayer, and the concept of sterilization was about as foreign as the moon. So a tooth extraction was, for many, just another unpleasant fact of life, like taxes or the plague. Sweet decay. The rich had it. Worse, oddly enough, the wealthy often had worse teeth than the poor. Why? Sugar. While peasants were gnawing on rye bread and onions, nobles were feasting on candied fruit, sweetmeats, and anything glazed with honey. Medieval cooks, bless them, loved sugar. They'd put it in meat pies, wine, and even fish dishes, because sweet equaled sophisticated, so aristocrats, who could afford these luxuries, were essentially pioneering the world's first dental crisis. Some chroniclers even mention royal figures with visibly blackened teeth. This wasn't considered ideal, but it also wasn't quite the social death sentence you'd expect. After all, everyone smelled bad. You could only judge so much. The logic here was less science and more vibes. Some cures were slightly more practical. People used cloves, vinegar, or wine as antiseptics. Others recommended holding herbs in your mouth while praying to Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of dentistry, who, fittingly, had all her teeth violently removed in martyrdom. It's comforting to think that even 700 years ago, people were combining faith and questionable home remedies to deal with dental pain. Some things never change. False teeth? Sort of now. What if you wanted to replace a missing tooth? Surprisingly, yes, this was sometimes attempted. We have records from the later Middle Ages of people crafting rudimentary dentures out of wood, ivory, or bone. They weren't comfortable, they weren't convincing, and they definitely weren't hygienic. But they existed. The most creative examples involved using animal teeth, sometimes human ones, purchased or taken from corpses. The idea was that the tooth of a young, healthy person might somehow transfer vitality to its new owner. Naturally, it didn't. But in an era where leeches were considered medicinal, no one was really keeping score. Even the act of implanting teeth was tried as early as the 15th century. A French surgeon wrote about placing donor teeth into empty sockets, noting that it sometimes succeeded. We can only imagine how success was defined in that context. Probably the patient didn't die immediately. The sound of silence and soft food. So what happened once you'd lost too many teeth to chew properly? You adapted. Medieval diets were actually quite accommodating to toothless diners. Pottages, thick stews of grains, meat, and vegetables, were common across social classes. Bread could be softened in ale or broth. In monasteries, older monks were often given specially prepared meals that required minimal chewing. It's one of those quiet, practical details that never makes it into the history books. The kitchen boy patiently mashing peas for an elderly knight who can no longer bite. The nobility had an advantage here. Of course, they could afford servants to slice, soak, or puree their food long before blenders were invented. It's a small comfort, but when your teeth were gone and your gums were raw, a bowl of warm mush might have felt like a blessing. The saint of toothaches. Let's linger for a moment on Saint Apollonia. In the 3rd century, she was a Christian martyr in Alexandria who refused to renounce her faith, so her captors knocked out all her teeth before burning her alive. Centuries later, she became the go-to saint for anyone with dental pain. By the Middle Ages, her image appeared everywhere, carved into church altars, painted in illuminated manuscripts, and invoked during particularly bad toothaches. People prayed to her, holding little models of teeth made of wax or silver. It's hard not to admire that kind of commitment, both hers and theirs. Toothache was one of the most universal sufferings of the age. And here was a saint who'd experienced it to the absolute extreme. If nothing else, it gave people someone to complain to. When medicine met superstition by now, you've probably noticed that medieval medicine tended to blur the line between science and sorcery. Dental care was no exception. There were toothworms. For instance, Tiny creatures people believed lived inside teeth, nibbling away at the root and causing pain. This idea lasted well into the 18th century, and in fairness, when you don't have microscopes, invisible worms is a reasonably imaginative guess. Some practitioners even claim to extract these worms by applying hot mixtures to the tooth, watching as something, usually the pulp or resin, wriggled free. It was a fine bit of theater. The patient left, convinced they'd been cured, and the barber got paid. Everyone won. Others mixed astrology into their dental work, advising extractions only on certain moon phases, because obviously pulling a molar under the wrong constellation could anger the heavens. It's easy to laugh at now, but given the alternatives, no pain relief, no antibiotics, no antiseptics, a little celestial reassurance probably helped. A world of ache and ail so. What did medieval people really do when they lost their teeth? Mostly they carried on. They soaked their bread. They mashed their stew. They prayed to a saint. They tried strange cures that mostly didn't work, and occasionally let a man with suspiciously strong arms and no medical degree pull out their molars. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't clean, but it was remarkably human. The same mix of desperation, faith, and hope that still defines our approach to health centuries later. And next time you grumble about the dentist, you can remember, at least yours washes his hands. Let's drift over in part 2 to some of the real-life cases. Kings, queens, and saints who suffered through the agony of medieval dentistry with varying degrees of grace. Bread, bone, and bad dentistry. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time before fluoride toothpaste, before the humble toothbrush as we know it, and long before anyone thought to schedule a regular dental checkup. So, get comfortable, dim the lights, maybe make yourself a cup of tea that won't ruin your enamel. Because tonight, we're wandering through the medieval world of missing teeth, crumbling smiles, and the surprisingly creative ways people tried to cope when their mouths began to fall apart. Let's start with something simple. Bread. Because if you want to understand medieval teeth, you start with what they were chewing. In most of Europe, bread was life. It was breakfast, lunch, and dinner, often with a side of slightly different bread. And this bread wasn't your soft, fluffy modern loaf. It was dense, heavy, sometimes closer in texture to sandstone than sourdough. The flour was milled with stone, literally ground against it, which meant little flakes of grit were baked right into the dough. So every bite was a tiny act of dental warfare. Even peasants in their 20s could have teeth worn down flat as marble, not from sugar or cavities, but from a lifetime of chewing the equivalent of edible sandpaper. And once enamel was gone, there wasn't much left to protect. Teeth cracked. Infections settled in, and before long, there were gaps where molars used to be. Now, what did they do about it? Well, not much, at least not at first. In medieval Europe, losing a tooth wasn't exactly an emergency. It was just part of the slow collapse of the human body. If you were poor, you probably just accepted it. Maybe you chewed on one side of your mouth, or stuck to softer foods, like pottage. that thin, mushy stew of grains and vegetables. If you were rich, things got a little more interesting, because the upper classes had the same dental problems as everyone else, but they had the money to make it worse. Let's take medieval sugar, for example. Imported luxury, sold in tiny cones wrapped like treasure. The wealthy adored it. Candied fruits, sugared almonds, and elaborate sweetmeats that announced your status the moment you opened your mouth. But, naturally, it came at a price. The most common dentist was actually your local barber. Yes, the same man who cut your hair, bled you with leeches, and occasionally offered medical opinions based on astrology. The barber surgeon's toolkit was versatile. Razors, scissors, hooks, forceps, and when needed, something charmingly called a tooth key. Imagine a small iron handle ending in a metal claw. You'd place it over the tooth, twist sharply, and if everything went right, it came out. If it didn't, well, you could always come back tomorrow. Tooth extraction was done without anesthesia. A few people drank heavily before the procedure. Others prayed. Some simply fainted, which in hindsight was probably the best possible outcome. After the tooth was gone, there wasn't much you could do except rinse with wine and hope you didn't die of infection. Now, you might wonder, did anyone try to replace their missing teeth? Yes, in ways that ranged from ingenious to deeply upsetting. Some people made false teeth from animal bone or ivory. These were carved roughly into shape and tied into the mouth with string or wire. They didn't fit well, they hurt, and they smelled. Predictably terrible. The truly wealthy had access to another option. Transplantation. And by transplantation, I mean paying a servant or beggar to have one of their teeth pulled out and jammed into your mouth instead. This was considered cutting-edge medicine around the 15th century. There's a famous record of tooth transplants continuing well into the 18th century, with poor Londoners selling their molars to rich ladies for cash. The practice even had a fashionable name, donor dentistry, which sounds noble until you realize nobody was volunteering. Of course, most of these transplanted teeth promptly fell out again. The body tends to reject random mouth parts from strangers, no matter how much you paid for them. But for a brief shining moment, it was considered the height of sophistication. Let's drift a bit deeper into the daily lives of medieval people, because dental care wasn't completely non-existent. There were toothbrushes of a sort. In Islamic regions, people used miswak, a natural chew stick from the Salvadora persica tree. It's mildly antiseptic, and it actually works quite well. In Christian Europe, people preferred cloth or twigs, rubbed along the teeth with ash, salt, or powdered herbs. Some used vinegar, others wine, or even crushed eggshells. A few recipes for tooth powder survive from medieval manuscripts. They include ingredients like burnt hartshorn, that's powdered deer antler, pumice, pepper, and myrrh. Which sounds fancy until you remember that pumice is, essentially, volcanic sand. One of the earliest written guides to dental hygiene came from a 12th century physician named Albucasis. He advised people to clean their teeth regularly, avoid hard foods, and importantly to check for worms because, yes, Medieval doctors firmly believed that toothache was caused by small worms living inside your molars. This wasn't just a rumor. Learned men wrote about it. Artists illustrated it. To prove their existence, barbers sometimes heated metal needles and stuck them into decaying teeth to kill the worm. The fact that patients stopped screaming afterward only reinforced the idea that the worm had died. Now, losing teeth wasn't just a health problem, it could be social. A gap-toothed smile carried different meanings depending on where and when you lived. In early medieval times, missing teeth were normal. Nobody expected perfect smiles. But among nobles, appearance mattered. Chronic halitosis and tooth loss were seen as unseemly, especially in courtly settings where one was expected to recite poetry and nibble delicacies without bleeding. There are accounts of medieval queens and courtiers who refused to speak publicly once their teeth began to rot. Isabella of Castile, for example, was said to suffer from terrible breath and decaying teeth in later life. So did many of her European contemporaries, but others leaned into it. In some parts of northern Europe, a wide gap between the front teeth was actually considered charming, a lucky trait, even sexy. Chaucer mentions it approvingly in the Canterbury Tales. His lusty wife of Bath is described as gat-toothed, meaning gap-toothed, a sign of vitality and strong appetites. So yes, at least for a while, missing teeth could be a flirtation strategy. Now, let's drift over to monasteries and apothecaries, because this is where most of the medieval dental science lived. Monks preserved Greek and Arabic medical texts, and they sometimes made their own tooth remedies. These often mixed religion with rudimentary chemistry. You might find instructions like, take powdered coral and mix it with wine and the ashes of burnt bread. Say 3 prayers to Saint Apollonia and anoint the gums. By the way, was the patron saint of dentistry, because according to legend, her teeth were violently pulled out during martyrdom. Medieval people prayed to her for relief from toothache, which feels darkly appropriate. Another common cure involved heating a mixture of honey and pepper, applying it to the aching spot, and waiting for the pain or the tooth to go away. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it set your mouth on fire, but it was at least a step up from the other popular method, applying live leeches to the gums. Yes, that happened. And no, it didn't help. In cities like Paris and London, tooth drawers advertised their services in public squares. They were a mix of showmen and opportunists, part dentist, part street performer. You'd see them on market day, holding up a freshly yanked molar to cheering crowds, promising instant relief. They often wore bright clothes, carried banners, and shouted slogans about their miraculous cures. It was loud, theatrical, and probably terrifying. These men traveled with jars of pulled teeth as proof of their skill. Sometimes they had assistants, usually burly apprentices whose job was to hold down the customer. One English chronicler noted that the best tooth drawers were those with a strong arm and a light conscience, which feels like the right ratio for any medieval medical professional. By now, you might be wondering, Did anyone not suffer from bad teeth? Surprisingly, yes. Archaeological studies of medieval skeletons show that peasants often had fewer cavities than nobles. Why? Because they didn't have access to refined sugar. Their diets were rough but simple: grains, vegetables, a bit of meat, ale, and water. They also lost teeth from wear and infection, but not from decay. So while the upper classes were dissolving their molars with imported sweets, peasants were simply grinding theirs down to stumps through honest, gritty labor. And in a strange way, both sides met at the same end, toothless, but for entirely different reasons. Let's pause here for a moment. Imagine for a second sitting in a candlelit hall somewhere in 13th century England. You're 40 years old, which is a respectable age. Your teeth ache constantly. You've stopped smiling at feasts because every laugh hurts. Across the table sits the local barber, sharpening his metal tool in the firelight. He tells you it will only take a moment. And you believe him, because what else can you do? And that is where we'll leave it for now. In the next part, we'll drift further into the late medieval and Renaissance eras, when dentistry began to professionalize, when fake teeth got fancier, and when royals started taking their smiles a bit more seriously, often with disastrous results. So settle in, take a breath. We'll pick up with the Tudors and the truly tragic mouth of Henry VIII, the delightful uncertainty of being dead. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a time when death was negotiable. So, settle in. Dim the lights, maybe pull the blanket up just a little higher, and let your brain start to unwind. Because tonight's story isn't about murder, or ghosts, or anything quite so exciting. It's about paperwork, or rather, the glorious absence of it. Back before fingerprints, photographs, and DNA, the line between dead and just inconveniently missing was porous. And for some people, that little gap was a golden opportunity. If you owed money, or annoyed the king, or made a romantic decision that was, let's say, ill-advised, you could simply die conveniently, quietly, and, if you planned it right, permanently, at least on paper. The Middle Ages and the early modern period were full of people who just stopped being alive without much verification. There were no coroners, no autopsies, and no IDs tucked into doublets. A local priest might write your name in a parish death register, based entirely on rumor. And if the body was too burned, drowned, or eaten by wolves to be identified, well, that was that. The living could simply agree that you were dead, which meant you could agree too. From a distance. Let's start with one of the most famous examples. Martin Guerre, the 16th century French peasant, who inspired centuries of fascination and one very confused courtroom. Martin was a Basque farmer, married young to a woman named Bertrande. They lived a simple life in the village of Artigat, at least until Martin had a particularly bad argument with his father-in-law and vanished. He left behind his wife, his child, and a general sense of confusion. Years passed, and then someone came back. A man appeared, claiming to be Martin Guerre. He looked like Martin, spoke like Martin, remembered childhood details only Martin could have known. He even moved into the house, resumed marital duties, and ran the family farm quite competently. Everyone accepted him, until Martin's uncle got suspicious, which is always how these stories go. A long court case followed, full of emotional testimonies, and just as the impostor was about to be acquitted, the real Martin Guerre walked into the courtroom with a wooden leg. Because, of course, he did. The impostor, named Arnaud Dutil, was hanged, and Bertrande, who had lived quite contentedly with him for 3 years, quietly returned to her original husband, which must have made for some very uncomfortable breakfasts. Now, Martin Guerre's case wasn't exactly a faked death, more of a borrowed identity, but it reveals how easy identity theft once was. No ID, no records, and everyone's memory a little fuzzy after a few years. But for others, the trick was simpler. Fake the death, disappear, and never come back. Take the 14th century knight William de Ferrers, who staged his own demise during the chaos of the 100 Years' War. He owed an unpleasant amount of money, enough to make living dangerous, so he died abroad. His estate was divided, debts cancelled, and prayers said for his soul. A few years later, William reappeared, alive, very apologetic, and claiming he'd been captured by the French, which was, at the time, the medieval equivalent of, "I lost my phone." No one could prove otherwise. So William got his land back, his wife back, and, presumably, a fresh round of debts. For years afterward, Elizabeth lived like a ghost in her own father's court, carefully raised, but carefully ignored. No one dared mention Anne Boleyn's name. And yet, in a strangely Tudor way, her survival became her greatest. Inheritance. Elizabeth learned early how to vanish in plain sight. Skill that would serve her perfectly when she grew into one of England's most formidable monarchs. She was her mother's revenge in a way. Quiet, calculating, and, just as Henry feared, entirely her own. But Anne's story wasn't unique, not in that century, and not in any palace. Let's drift forward a little, or sideways, maybe to Mary, Queen of Scots. Another queen who met the blade, another child left in the ruins. Mary was executed in 1587, wearing scarlet, the color of martyrdom, and also, coincidentally, excellent contrast against a gray English morning. Her son, James, was just 13 when she died. though they hadn't seen each other in years. When James was a baby, Mary had been forced to abdicate and flee. He was taken from her, raised by Protestant nobles who politely despised his mother, and educated to see her as a warning, a living cautionary tale. When Anne failed to produce a male heir, and when her sharp tongue outlasted Henry's patience, she was accused of adultery, incest, and witchcraft, because of course she was, and executed in 1536. It was all done very neatly. The French executioner was said to be swift, elegant, and only mildly terrifying. And then, in the silence that followed, there was Elizabeth, a little girl, not even 3 years old, suddenly transformed from princess to lady. The royal nursery was cleared out. Her clothes were inventoried. Her mother's portraits were removed from the palace walls, and servants who once bowed deeply now barely nodded. It's worth remembering that proof of death was, for centuries, completely subjective. Bodies decomposed quickly. Battlefields were chaotic. Travel was slow. If someone drowned or fell from a horse into a ravine, there was no CSI Normandy. You buried whoever you found, and if you found no one, you simply guessed. People also tended to want the dead to stay dead. Declaring a spouse or debtor gone to God was far simpler than chasing ghosts through Europe. So, faked deaths often succeeded, because everyone involved quietly agreed not to look too hard. Let's drift now to one of the strangest, royal cases of mistaken death or deliberate disappearance. Joan of Arc's not-so-dead. Reputation. After her execution in 1431, several women popped up across France claiming to be Joan, miraculously escaped from English flames. The most convincing was a woman named Claude des Armoise. Claude looked like Joan. She spoke with her accent, and she knew personal details about Joan's family that no outsider should have known. Even Joan's brothers accepted her as their sister, either out of hope or opportunity. Claude was welcomed at noble courts, given gifts, even paraded as the resurrected Maid of Orleans, until, inevitably, the church got involved. After some awkward questioning, she confessed to being an impostor and faded back into obscurity. But her success, however brief, shows just how thin the boundary between life and death really was in an age without photos or proof. If you had the right story and a little nerve, resurrection was perfectly achievable. We can't talk about this without mentioning the mysterious fate of King Sebastian of Portugal, who vanished in battle in 1578 and refused, rather rudely, to stay dead. Sebastian died, or supposedly died, during a disastrous crusade in Morocco. His body was never recovered, and that as any good impostor knows, is an open invitation. Over the next few decades, at least 4 different men appeared across Europe claiming to be King Sebastian, older, wiser, and definitely not dead. They ranged from minor nobles to total frauds, and one even managed to gather a small army of believers before being executed. The Portuguese people called the phenomenon Sebastianism, a kind of national obsession with the idea that their lost king would return. And honestly, it's hard to blame them. When life is miserable and your monarch disappears mysteriously, it's nice to imagine he's just hiding somewhere, waiting for the right dramatic moment. Sebastian never came back, of course, but his legend lingered for centuries. Proof that sometimes the hope of a faked death was more powerful than the truth. Of course, it wasn't just kings and knights trying to vanish. Ordinary people did it too, especially those with debts, crimes, or occasionally inconvenient marriages. A medieval man could drown accidentally in a river, then reappear a few towns over with a new name and a slightly different haircut. If anyone noticed the resemblance, he could simply insist he was a cousin. And with no central authority to verify anything, who could argue? One 15th-century Englishman, John Rykener, pulled an even stranger trick. He was a cross-dressing con artist who alternated between being Eleanor and John, depending on who was asking. When caught for fraud, he briefly died under one name, only to resurface later under the other. Technically, he didn't fake a death. He just faked a life, but it worked for years. If all this sounds chaotic, that's because it was, for most of human history. Identity was local. You were known by your neighbors, your parish, your debts. Once you walked more than 10 miles away, you might as well have been a different person. There were no databases, no photographs, no central registries, which made life inconvenient for the innocent, but wonderfully flexible for the imaginative. A merchant could declare bankruptcy, disappear overseas, and start fresh. A widow could quietly remarry without ever confirming her first husband's actual death. Even clergy occasionally tried it, often to escape vows that had become tiresome. The line between desertion and resurrection was paper-thin. Let's pause a moment here and breathe, because all of this, the vanishing acts, the imposters, the miracles, happened in a world where most people never traveled far enough to see a horizon change. Disappearance was easy precisely because everything else was small. Communities were tight, but records were loose, so when someone vanished, you were left with stories, and those stories could grow into whatever truth people needed. The glitter fades, hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to the candlelit courts of Europe, where silk rustled, secrets whispered, and perfume covered a multitude of sins. So, go ahead. Dim the lights, settle somewhere soft, and maybe take a moment to appreciate that you don't live in a century where your romantic prospects depend entirely on royal favor, inherited titles, or how your neck looked in a ruff. Because tonight's story is about royal mistresses, the most envied, scrutinized, and disposable women in history, and what became of them once beauty faded, power cooled, and the crown turned its gaze elsewhere. The life of a royal mistress was supposed to be glamorous. Jewels, estates, influence, but under all that velvet was a quiet, ticking clock. You see, the moment a mistress arrived at court, she was already on borrowed time. Every smile, every compliment, every scandalous evening dance was one step closer to being replaced. And when that day came, when youth faltered and favor vanished, the descent could be brutal. Some were quietly married off to obscure nobles, some were exiled to convents, and a few lingered in half-remembered limbo, neither honored nor forgotten. Just awkwardly there. Let's start, as we often do, in France, because of course we do. Part 1, continued. France, where mistresses were practically. Furniture, no court in Europe perfected the art of the mistress quite like the French. From the Valois to the Bourbons, they elevated adultery to something approaching civic duty. King Francis I, who reigned in the early 1500s, treated mistresses like accessories. He had one for wit, one for politics, and one for what he called recreation, which is an impressively polite way to describe indecency. Francis's mistresses often retired with pensions and small chateaux. But the court was dangerous for aging beauty. When his favorite, Anne de Pisseleu, Duchess of Étampes, grew older and politically inconvenient, she was banished from court entirely. She spent her later years in genteel obscurity, writing letters about how unfair men were, a theme that never goes out of style. Then there was Henri II of France and his remarkable mistress, Diane de Poitiers. Diane was 20 years older than Henri, which, for a royal mistress, was about as likely as the king taking up carpentry. She was 40 when he was 20, elegant, composed, and, by all accounts, disturbingly ageless. She swam daily, drank liquid gold for her complexion, which naturally killed her slowly, and managed to remain the king's obsession for 2 decades. But when Henri died unexpectedly, in a tragic jousting accident, because, of course, Diane's reign ended overnight. His widow, the long-suffering Catherine de' Medici, wasted no time ordering Diane to return every royal jewel, palace, and token she had ever received. Catherine even forced her out of the chateau of Chenonceau, which Diane had lovingly transformed into a fairy tale estate. Diane, now in her 60s and heavily dosed with gold, retired quietly to her country house and died there. Still beautiful, still composed, and probably slightly radioactive. The pattern repeats through centuries. The mistress rises. The mistress glows. And then, softly, quietly, she's removed. By the time of Louis XIV, the system had become institutional. The maîtresse en titre, the official mistress, held rank, income, and her own apartments at Versailles. There was paperwork for adultery, which is a sentence that perfectly sums up France. Louise's most famous mistress, Madame de Montespan, was witty, powerful, and terrifying. For over a decade she ruled the court, orchestrating marriages, patronizing artists, and whispering policy into the king's ear. Then she was implicated in the affair of the poisons, a vast scandal involving black masses, love potions, and casual accusations of witchcraft, which, in hindsight, is not great PR. Montespan was never formally convicted, but the king quietly began to avoid her. He found new company, younger, less associated with powdered toads. By the end, the great Montespan retired to a convent, a fate that, for old mistresses, was practically standard issue. She spent her final years fasting, praying, and apologizing for everything, which must have taken a while. And then came Madame de Maintenon, Montespan's successor, and in many ways her opposite. She started as the governess to the king's illegitimate children, which is not normally a career path that leads to semi-royal status. But Maintenon was calm, intelligent, and quietly devout. When Montespan fell, Maintenon filled the void not with glamour, but with piety. By the 1680s, she had become the king's companion, and, secretly, his wife, unofficial, of course, because she wasn't royal, but she ruled Versailles with silence and modesty, instead of jewels and scandal. It worked, until she grew old, and the king grew tired, not of her exactly, but of everything. When he died, she withdrew to a convent she'd founded, Saint-Cyr, where she lived out her final days quietly instructing young girls on virtue, which must have been a little awkward, given her resume. Now, England handled things differently, or at least less elegantly. English mistresses had none of France's glamour, but all the same instability. During the Restoration, Charles II filled his court with women who made Versailles look like a monastery. His favorites included Barbara Villiers, the tempestuous Duchess of Cleveland, and Nell Gwynn, an actress who called him her Old Rowley, the name of his favorite horse, which was affectionate, if a bit unflattering, Barbara was beautiful, imperious, and destructive. When she aged, she tried to hold her position by sheer force of will and scandal. She threw tantrums, fought other mistresses, and occasionally showed up at court in a fury just to remind everyone she still existed. Eventually, Charles pensioned her off to the countryside, where she lived expensively and unhappily until her death. Nell Gwyn's ending was gentler. She never pretended to be more than she was, a cheerful commoner with a royal problem. When Charles died, his brother, the new king, honored the late monarch's dying request. "Let not poor Nellie starve." She didn't. She retired comfortably, remembered fondly, and died of a stroke. One of the very few royal mistresses to exit life with dignity and solvency. Across Europe, the same slow rhythm played out. Youth, favor, wealth, then exile, obscurity, repentance. Sometimes the king provided pensions or marriages to aging favorites, which sounds kind until you realize those husbands were usually hand-picked to be dull, safe, and very, very forgettable. In Spain, the mistresses of Philip IV were often packed off to convents as soon as they became inconvenient. He fathered at least 30 children, legitimate and otherwise, which is frankly exhausting to think about. When one of his longtime mistresses, Maria Inés Calderón, known as La Calderona, grew tired of royal life, she faked her own death and became a nun. A surprisingly popular retirement plan among royal women. She lived quietly, writing letters to her son, who inconveniently became a general. So much for secrecy. The 18th century made mistresses more powerful than ever, and also more precarious. They weren't just romantic ornaments anymore. They were political figures, diplomatic alliances, artistic patronage, entire wars sometimes bent around them. But all that power only made their falls more spectacular. No one embodied that better than Madame de Pompadour. She was the official mistress of Louis XV, a king so indolent and disinterested that it's unclear if he ever noticed when wars began. Pompadour wasn't born noble. She was the daughter of a bourgeois family. But she had charm, intelligence, and a dazzling grasp of how to decorate things. She became Louis's constant companion, his artistic advisor, and the engine behind Rococo France. She hosted philosophers, funded architecture, designed palaces, and even arranged the king's future mistresses when her own health declined. Because when life gives you gout, you delegate. Pompadour died relatively young at 42, and the king, for once, wept. She had achieved something almost unheard of for a royal mistress. She remained respected, even loved, right to the end. Her successor, Madame du Barry, was less fortunate. Pretty, naive, and fond of jewels, she came from the lower classes and never really learned the art of being discreet. When Louis XV died, his grandson Louis XVI promptly banished her from court. She begged to stay, not for love, but because Versailles had excellent heating. Eventually, she was allowed to live quietly on her estate, where she collected diamonds, threw small parties, and tried very hard not to be noticed. Then came the French Revolution, which is never good news for anyone with Madame in front of their name. She was executed by guillotine in 1793, protesting that she'd never hurt anyone, which was true, but not helpful. Her final words, reportedly, were pleas to the executioner to go slowly, not to ruin her hair. Even in death, image management remained her strongest instinct. And so, as centuries turned, the story of the royal mistress followed the same weary arc, from shimmer to shadow, from silks to sermons. For every pompadour who ended gracefully, there were dozens of Montespan, Clevelands, and Calderonas who drifted away into quiet embarrassment, so get comfortable. We'll pick up again in the soft twilight of the 18th and 19th centuries, where diamonds still glittered, but the thrones beneath them were beginning to shake. The royal nose knows hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time before deodorant, before toothpaste, before anyone thought that bathing more than once a month might be a good idea. So go ahead, get comfortable. Dim the lights. Maybe light a candle. Or don't, if that feels historically authentic. Because tonight, we're wandering through the perfumed halls and occasionally rancid corridors of medieval nobility. We're asking a simple question. What did medieval nobles actually smell like? And, just as importantly, did anyone care? Because if there's one thing history proves over and over again, it's that rich people have always smelled a little better than everyone else. But not by much. Let's start with the basics. In the Middle Ages, most people believed that bathing was risky. Not because they didn't like being clean exactly, but because they thought water opened the pores, letting in disease, which, to be fair, in a time when rivers doubled as open sewers, wasn't completely wrong. Doctors warned that bathing could weaken your vital humors, and humors were very important back then. You had to keep them balanced, hot, cold, wet, dry. Everything from your personality to your scent was blamed on them. So, many nobles preferred to bathe with cloths. They'd rub themselves down with linen soaked in rose water or vinegar, then call it a day. No rinsing, no scrubbing. Just a gentle dab and a prayer. Royal courts did have baths, of course. luxurious. Wooden tubs lined with linen, filled with water, perfumed with herbs. Lavender, rosemary, thyme. A bath wasn't for hygiene, though. It was an event. In some castles, the bath would be set up in the bedchamber near the fire. Servants would pour buckets of hot water, and the noble would recline, maybe sip wine, and discuss politics, or gossip about whoever hadn't been invited. Sometimes couples bathed together. Sometimes entire families did. Because why not? There wasn't much privacy in a castle anyway. But here's the thing. Even those grand baths didn't happen very often. A noble might bathe once a week if they were particularly clean, once a month if they were normal, and twice a year if they were, say, Philip II of Spain, which, by all accounts, he was. Now, we tend to imagine medieval nobles smelling like unwashed goats. But that's not quite right either. They actually smelled of cover-up, perfume, pomanders, scented gloves, rose water, layer upon layer of fragrant deception. Perfume was not sprayed but soaked into fabrics. Clothes were stored with sachets of herbs, dried flowers, and spices to mask any unfortunate undertones. Some nobles wore small metal balls, pomanders, filled with musk or ambergris, which is, unfortunately, whale vomit. A luxury item, if you can believe it. They believed these scents didn't just smell nice. They protected against disease. Bad smells, or miasmas, were thought to cause illness. So if you smelled good, you were safe, at least theoretically. Let's drift over to Queen Elizabeth of Hungary, or at least the legend of her. In the 14th century, someone invented Hungary water, a fragrant alcohol-based tonic made from rosemary and wine. It was supposed to rejuvenate the body, cure headaches, and, naturally, make you smell like divine royalty. The story goes that it was gifted to the aging queen, who used it so devotedly that she supposedly became so beautiful that the King of Poland proposed to her. She was 72 at the time, which, if true, is the world's earliest example of anti-aging marketing. We should pause and think about what these perfumes were masking. Castles weren't known for their fresh air. Inside, there were fires burning day and night. The air was thick with smoke, animal fat, damp wool, and people. Dogs and falcons wandered through the halls. Servants carried trays of food and chamber pots. Well, let's just say plumbing was not a royal strong suit. Even the cleanest noble couldn't entirely rise above the atmosphere. So perfumes weren't just luxury. They were survival. You might wonder about teeth. Did nobles have bad breath? Yes, they absolutely did. Toothbrushes weren't common in Europe until much later. Instead, people chewed herbs or used rough cloths to wipe their teeth. Tooth powders existed, made of burnt salt, crushed shells, or sage, but dentists did not. Henry VIII, who loved sweetmeats and wine, reportedly had blackened teeth by middle age. His courtiers copied him, because of course they did. Fashion always wins, even when it's terrible. Still, we can't paint all medieval nobles with one smelly brush. Regional differences mattered. In southern Europe, bathing culture lingered from the Roman world. Bathhouses remained in use far longer in Italy and Spain, often run by monasteries or civic authorities. People there were more likely to take a plunge, or at least a rinse, than their northern counterparts. In England or France, however, things cooled off fast. By the 14th century, public bathhouses had a reputation for extracurricular activities. Let's just say hot water wasn't the only attraction. The church frowned upon them, and soon bathing itself began to feel morally suspicious. So nobles retreated into private tubs and perfumed cloths, while peasants simply kept working. Let's wander, for a moment, into Charlemagne's bathing habits. He ruled in the 8th century, long before the smells good, feels bad philosophy of later medieval medicine took over. Charlemagne loved bathing. He built massive hot springs at Aachen and bathed daily, often with his friends, guards, and family, which sounds less like hygiene and more like an awkward team-building exercise, but still. He was, by early medieval standards, a very clean man. Unfortunately, his descendants did not inherit the habit. By the time of the later French kings, bathing had become rare again, though, interestingly, so had competence. If you were a noblewoman, your scent mattered even more. Ladies had entire arsenals of beauty aids: powdered rice, rose oil, violet water, civet musk. Hair was washed occasionally, but more often just sprinkled with scented powders and combed out with oils. And to protect the skin, they used lead-based creams, which, yes, caused slow poisoning. But at least you'd smell faintly floral while dying. Even garments were part of the olfactory hierarchy. Rich people wore linen closest to the body. Then, layers of silk and wool, all of which absorbed and retained perfumes beautifully. Peasants wore rough wool straight on the skin, which trapped sweat, mud, and everything else they came across. So even when nobles didn't bathe, they still smelled expensive. If you're wondering whether anyone actually cared about these differences, the answer is, mostly, yes. Scent was a social signal. A sweet smell meant purity, virtue, wealth. A foul one meant poverty, sin, or illness. People literally judged your moral worth by your aroma. In royal courts, smelling good wasn't just pleasant. It was political. Ambassadors were greeted in perfumed halls. Banquets were drenched in rose water. Even letters were sometimes scented before being sealed. The nobility lived in a cloud of symbolic fragrance. They smelled of sanctity, sophistication, and just enough deception to mask the occasional bathless fortnight. And yet, even the most perfumed noble couldn't escape time, because after a few centuries of roses, musk, and ambergris, the human nose adjusts. By the late 15th century, chroniclers began to note that nobles themselves were becoming numb to strong scents. Perfume recipes grew ever more elaborate, almost absurd. Mixes of cinnamon, clove, civet, sandalwood, and sometimes a hint of ground pearl, which, yes, was as expensive and pointless as it sounds. The more they tried to smell divine, the more they just smelled like a very rich apothecary. Because next, we're drifting deeper into the scented labyrinth, the strange rituals of courtly cleanliness, the rise of the perfumed glove, and the monarchs who thought bathing was for peasants. So, get comfortable. That said, bathing wasn't unheard of. In fact, in many places, it was downright fashionable. Public bathhouses existed across Europe, especially in the early Middle Ages. In cities like Paris, London, and Prague, you could find steamy wooden rooms where people soaked in tubs, shared gossip, and occasionally more than that. Because, as tends to happen, bathhouses quickly became associated with other pleasures. By the 14th century, many were less spa and more social experiment. Authorities periodically shut them down for reasons that ranged from morality to plague prevention. Still, for several centuries, a good bath was part of normal life for those who could afford the time and the coin. Soap was made from animal fat and ash, sometimes scented with herbs if you were fancy. The water wasn't pristine, but it was warm, and for a few blissful moments, you could pretend to be cleaner than you were. When bathhouses began closing during outbreaks of plague, because naturally they made it worse, people turned instead to linen. They'd change their undergarments more often, believing that clean linen absorbed impurities from the body. This was, in a roundabout way, true. Linen does absorb sweat. It also smells less terrible than wool. So, in a very medieval compromise, people decided, if you can't wash the body, wash the shirt. A world of layers. Speaking of shirts, let's talk fashion hygiene. Medieval Europeans wore layers, lots of them, undergarments of linen. Over those, tunics or gowns, cloaks, hoods, hats. For nobles, everything was elaborate. For peasants, simpler. But still layers upon layers. Speaking of shirts, Let's talk fashion hygiene. Medieval Europeans wore layers, lots of them, undergarments of linen. Over those, tunics or gowns, cloaks, hoods, hats. Drifting toward the guillotine, hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back to revolutionary France, that calm, reasonable era known for equality, fraternity, and the enthusiastic removal of heads. So, dim the lights. Find something warm to wrap around you, and let's quietly wander through one of history's strangest questions. What actually happened to people who survived the guillotine? It sounds like the setup to a ghost story. But in the late 18th century, when science and spectacle mingled with public executions, this was taken very seriously. Doctors, revolutionaries, even philosophers, all wanted to know the same thing. How long can a head stay alive after it's been cut off? It's a grim thought. But in fairness, this was an age when curiosity had flexible ethics. And since the guillotine was seen as a symbol of modern efficiency, many were determined to prove it was not only quick, but humane. In the same way, one might try to reassure someone that drowning isn't that bad. So tonight, we'll explore that strange intersection between medicine, morality, and morbid fascination. We'll meet a few unlucky, or perhaps too lucky, individuals who found themselves blinking, gasping, or even trying to speak after their supposed instant death. We'll learn how scientists tested it, how executioners noticed it, and how society coped with the eerie idea that perhaps, for a few seconds, the condemned was still aware. The birth of the humane, death machine before, we get to the survivors, or semi-survivors. We have to understand why the guillotine existed in the first place. It wasn't invented by a sadist. It was proposed by a doctor. Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin, to be exact, a man who, despite the name association, neither designed nor built the device himself. He merely suggested that France needed a more equal form of execution. Before the Revolution, nobles were often beheaded by sword, a risky art that could take several swings, while commoners were hanged, broken on the wheel, or worse. Guillotin wanted everyone to meet the same clean, merciful end. Because of course he did. Nothing says equality quite like industrialized decapitation. The actual machine was refined by another doctor, Antoine Louis, and constructed by a German harpsichord maker. Because, naturally, if you can tune strings, you can also align blades. It first came into use in 1792, and France, in its usual flair for efficiency, immediately set about testing it on animals, corpses, and, before long, the living. Witnesses were amazed at how quick it was. A flash of silver, a thump, and the head fell neatly into a basket. The crowd often gasped, then applauded. It was clean, modern, and, according to early reports, painless. But then came the unsettling part. Sometimes the heads moved. The heads that blinked from the very beginning. Executioners noticed strange things when they held up the severed head to show the crowd, as was traditional. The eyes sometimes opened. The mouth twitched. The lips formed silent. Words. And the eyes, horrifyingly, sometimes, seemed to look back. Now, a modern physiologist might calmly explain that this was due to nerve reflexes, a little post-mortem muscle activity. But 18th century observers weren't quite so sure. To them, it looked like the victim was alive, even if just for a few moments. In 1793, during the early days of the Reign of Terror, an assistant executioner named Sanson swore that when he picked up a woman's head, her lips moved and the eyelids fluttered, as if in recognition. Another witness claimed the eyes of the famous Charlotte. Corday, the assassin of Marat, stared directly into his for several seconds after her death. He described her as having a look of indignation, which is quite a feat for someone missing the rest of their body. These stories spread quickly through Paris, stirring a peculiar mix of fascination and fear. Some people were horrified, others were thrilled, and inevitably a few scientists began to wonder, could the head, for a short while, still think? A very French experiment. You might expect that most people, upon hearing rumors of blinking severed heads, would try to avoid the topic altogether. But revolutionary France was not most people. Here, the Enlightenment and the guillotine went hand in hand. Doctors began conducting what they called observations. After all, it was for science. The most famous of these was a man named Dr. Bourrieu. In 1905, yes, over a century later, Bourrieu was given permission to examine the freshly severed head of a murderer named Languille. He later described the scene with clinical calm. Immediately after the fall of the blade, I called out his name. His eyelids lifted and his eyes focused on mine. I called again. His gaze became less distinct. At 15 seconds, all motion ceased. 15 seconds. That's a long time to hold eye contact in any circumstance, much less with a disembodied head. Bourrieu concluded that consciousness probably persisted for several seconds after decapitation, long enough for the victim to register what had happened. Naturally, this did not improve the guillotine's reputation as a humane instrument, but Bourrieu wasn't the first. Throughout the 19th century, other doctors had tried similar tests, calling out names, pricking cheeks, watching pupils dilate. The results varied, but the fascination never faded. Even during the French Revolution itself, executioners would whisper about those who blinked or sighed, as if their spirits were struggling to catch up with their bodies. Survivors. Almost technically, no one is supposed to survive the guillotine. That's sort of the point. But there were, over the centuries, a few bizarre incidents where the blade failed, either through mechanical fault, bad aim, or sheer stubborn anatomy. One such case involved a man named Henri Languille, the same one Bourrieu examined later. During earlier tests, executioners noted that if the blade was dull or poorly weighted, it sometimes didn't sever everything cleanly. The victim might twitch violently or even remain partially conscious for a few terrifying seconds. There are also stories, perhaps apocryphal, of condemned criminals whose necks were too muscular or thick, causing the blade to jam. In one account, the executioner had to pull the head off by hand. In another, the condemned man supposedly stood up after the first strike, dazed but alive before the blade was reset. Was this true? Probably not, but these tales spread, and the people loved them. Not out of pity, but curiosity. It was macabre entertainment, proof that even the perfect machine could misfire. The ethics of observation. As more reports of post-decapitation activity appeared, debate grew among doctors and philosophers. If the head was conscious for several seconds, was the guillotine truly merciful? And if it wasn't, did that mean France had industrialized torture under the banner of reason? The philosopher Joseph de Maistre wrote, with a hint of horror, that the guillotine reduced man to an object, a mere mechanism. Others, like the physiologist Legallois, argued that decapitation was actually fascinating proof that the brain could survive without the body, if only briefly. Because, of course, when faced with moral horror, the best response is to call it interesting. Still, the question lingered, and as technology advanced, scientists in the 19th century kept testing decapitated animals, chickens, dogs, frogs, even sheep, to measure how long reflexes continued. Some heads blinked for up to 30 seconds. A few twitched for minutes. The conclusion was both reassuring and unsettling. The brain likely lost consciousness within seconds, but reflexes could persist far longer. Meaning, your head might move, but you were probably already gone. Probably. France's last beheadings. By the early 20th century, the guillotine had become a relic, but it was still used in France, quietly, efficiently, and always behind prison walls. Public executions were banned in 1939, after crowds began treating them as social events, which admittedly they had been for over a century. The last public guillotining took place in June 1939, of a man named Eugen Weidmann. It caused such a scandal, with spectators leaning out of balconies and taking photographs, that the government decided to move executions indoors. After that, the guillotine was used privately, but it remained the official method of capital punishment in France until 1977, yes, 1977. The same year Star Wars premiered, someone in France was still being executed by guillotine. The final victim was Hamida Jandoubi, a Tunisian immigrant convicted of murder. By then, the machine was viewed less as humane innovation and more as a national embarrassment, a ghost of the revolution that refused to die. Capital punishment was officially abolished in France in 1981, closing the guillotine's two-century run. Let's drift gently now, away from the laboratory lights and the iron scent of the scaffold, to the quieter stories, the personal accounts of those who witnessed these moments. Because in the end, what people saw, or thought they saw, mattered just as much as what actually happened. In our next section, we'll meet the witnesses themselves, executioners, revolutionaries, doctors, and even priests, all convinced they saw life after the blade fell. The aroma of the ages. Hey, everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a time long before deodorant, perfume counters, or the sweet chemical safety of modern soap. A time when the air itself seemed thicker, heavier, perhaps a little earthier. Yes, tonight we're exploring what people actually smelled like in the Middle Ages. And no, we won't make it dramatic. This isn't a horror story, it's more of a gentle miasma, a slow, aromatic journey through sweat, incense, and centuries of questionable hygiene choices. So, go ahead, dim the lights, maybe light a candle, preferably one that doesn't smell like a tallow candle from 1320. And let's drift back to a world that was, shall we say, more fragrant than our own. Setting the scene. A different definition of clean. Let's start with something comforting. Medieval people did care about cleanliness. They just defined it differently. When we say clean, we tend to mean sterile, bacteria-free, sanitized, ideally lemon-scented medieval people. On the other hand, meant something more spiritual. To be clean was to be in harmony with the order of things. Modest, pure, balanced in the humors. Water, for them, wasn't always the solution. Sometimes it was part of the problem, because water, especially stagnant water, could make you sick. And in a world that didn't know what germs were, getting sick from a bath might just confirm your worst fears about vanity. So instead of scrubbing daily, most people aimed to avoid getting too dirty in the first place. It was a philosophy of prevention, medieval wellness, if you will. And when you live in a drafty cottage, or a stone castle filled with damp air and soot, sometimes the idea of taking off your layers for a wash was less about cleanliness, and more about survival. Bathhouses, the medieval spa, sort of. That said, bathing wasn't unheard of. In fact, in many places, it was downright fashionable. Public bathhouses existed across Europe, especially in the early Middle Ages. In cities like Paris, London, and Prague, you could find steamy wooden rooms where people soaked in tubs, shared gossip, and occasionally more than that. Because, as tends to happen, bathhouses quickly became associated with other pleasures. By the 14th century, many were less spa and more social experiment. A world of layers. Speaking of shirts, let's talk fashion hygiene. Medieval Europeans wore layers, lots of them, undergarments of linen. Over those, tunics or gowns, cloaks, hoods, hats. For nobles, everything was elaborate. For peasants, simpler, but still layers upon layers. It was warm, yes, but it also trapped smells like an enthusiastic sponge. The difference was that most people didn't notice, because everyone smelled. A nobleman's velvet doublet might be perfumed with ambergris, musk, or rosewater, partly for luxury, mostly for survival. Even royalty couldn't entirely mask the human condition. Henry V's court, for instance, reeked of sweat, roast meat, and the faint tang of the Thames. But among commoners, you'd find a more rustic bouquet: wood smoke, damp wool, ale, livestock, and, occasionally, garlic. It wasn't unpleasant to them. It was the smell of life. You could probably tell someone's profession just by walking behind them. The blacksmith smelled of iron and soot. The tanner smelled unmistakably of ammonia, because tanning leather required soaking hides in urine. And if you were a fisherman, well, your job description explains itself. It was, in every sense, a society of scent. The myth of the filthy medieval now. It's tempting to think everyone in the Middle Ages was just filthy, but that's actually a bit unfair. Records show that medieval people washed their hands and faces daily. Monks in particular had strict rules about cleanliness, though again, mostly for spiritual purity rather than germ theory. Bathing was encouraged before Mass, and washing before meals was considered basic etiquette. In some towns, water carriers even sold fresh water door to door. Of course, fresh is a relative term. This was often drawn from rivers that also doubled as laundromats and latrines. But it's the thought that counts. The myth of the dirty medieval comes mainly from later centuries, the Renaissance and Enlightenment eras, when people liked to feel superior to their ancestors. In truth, early medieval hygiene was surprisingly decent. It just declined over time, especially after the plague, when people started associating water with disease. So the smelliest centuries were actually the 15th and 16th, right when perfume, wigs, and powdered faces were coming into fashion. Naturally, as soon as people stopped bathing, they started inventing cologne. Perfume and powder, the scent of power. Let's drift for a moment into the perfumed halls of the aristocracy. Imagine a noble woman in 14th century France. Her gown is velvet, lined with fur. Her hair is scented with lavender oil. Her chamber is filled with burning herbs, rosemary, sage, or sweet flag, meant to purify the air. The air, by the way, needed a lot of purifying. Between chamber pots, damp rushes on the floor, and hundreds of unwashed bodies, castles were not the dreamy stone fortresses of fairy tales. They were echoing, aromatic echo chambers of humanity. Perfume became less about beauty and more about defense. Renaissance nobles practically marinated in musk, civet, and ambergris. Those last two came from the scent glands of animals. One from a cat-like creature, the other from the intestines of whales. Both were considered divine. It's rather poetic, in a slightly nauseating way, that the most expensive perfumes in history were made from animal secretions. But to the medieval mind, a strong smell was a sign of vitality, of life pushing back against decay. The idea of bad smells being dangerous also led to the use of pomanders, little metal balls filled with herbs or scented wax, worn around the neck or waist. People would lift them to their noses in the street, especially during outbreaks of plague, believing that sweet odors could ward off sickness. And, in fairness, they probably made the experience of medieval city life marginally more bearable. The urban scent symphony. Let's drift there now to the streets themselves. Imagine London. Around 1350, it's early morning. The sun hasn't quite burned off the mist, and already the streets are alive with noise and smell. Chimneys belch smoke from every cottage. Fishmongers shout over the sound of carts rattling through mud. Someone's emptied their chamber pot into the gutter, where it mixes with yesterday's waste. There's the sweetness of baking bread, the tang of leatherwork, the acid of spilled ale. Animals are everywhere. Horses, pigs, dogs, the occasional goat on its way to market. It's not that medieval cities were exceptionally filthy. It's that they were alive. Every activity produced a smell, and every smell lingered. There was no sewer system, no garbage trucks, no air freshener. Cities were ecosystems, human, animal, bacterial, all sharing the same narrow lanes. Yet people adapted. They hung fragrant herbs in their homes, burned incense, sprinkled lavender on their clothes. They didn't think of these as covering up odors. They thought of them as balancing them. To the medieval mind, balance was everything. A little rot, a little perfume, a little smoke. That was the smell of a world in equilibrium. Monks, myrrh, and the smell of sanctity. Not all smells were earthly. Some were divine. Medieval people often believed that holiness had a scent, literally. Saints were said to emit a sweet, incorruptible fragrance when their bodies were exhumed. Chroniclers described this as the odor of sanctity, proof that the saint's soul was pure. It's one of those wonderfully strange medieval ideas, the notion that goodness could be smelled. You might not be able to read or write, but if a holy man's corpse smelled like roses, you knew God approved. Monasteries also had their own scent: beeswax, parchment, ink, and incense. The daily rituals of burning frankincense and myrrh weren't just symbolic. They were also practical, masking the musty odor of too many men living in silence together. So while peasants smelled of soil and smoke, and nobles of musk and amber, monks carried a softer scent, one of wax and prayer. A nose-blind society. All of this raises a question. Did medieval people even notice how strong things smelled? Probably not. At least, not in the way we do. Modern noses are spoiled by cleanliness. We live in a world of filtered air, detergent, and sterile surfaces. Our senses have been declawed. Medieval people lived in constant sensory noise, sounds, textures, and yes, smells. They didn't separate the world into pleasant and unpleasant scents, so much as natural and corrupted. The stench of manure or fish wasn't a moral issue. The smell of disease or rot, though, that was different. It was thought to signify spiritual decay. Miasma, bad air, could spread illness, fear, and sin all at once. So while people tolerated human smells, they feared unearthly ones, When plague came, they covered their faces with posies and herbs, not because it helped, but because the reek of death was believed to carry the disease itself. And in a roundabout way, they were right. Bad smells did often come from decay and infection. They just hadn't quite sorted out the bacteria part. The medieval knows. So, what did people smell like? It depended on class, on season, on whether the nearest river was upstream or downstream of a tannery. The peasantry smelled of earth and labor. Ut fiu, clergy of smoke and incense, the nobility of perfume and underlying panic. But through it all, there was one unifying scent, humanity itself, unfiltered, unsterilized, unapologetic, and maybe that's the most honest fragrance of all.